of 1 Peter, in verse 13, Peter starts talking about our Christian behavior. And in verse 13 of chapter 2, he tells, and this is hard sometimes, but he tells us to submit ourselves to ordinances of man, to not be lawbreakers is basically what he's saying there. Follow set by man. Now, if we're Christians this morning, we shouldn't be out here running south of the laws, right? We should follow the ordinances that have been said. And he also tells us there in verse 13 to submit ourselves to the king as supreme. Now, depending on who the king is, that may be hard and it may not be. But we are to submit ourselves, at least show honor to the office, if not to the person. But he tells us to submit ourselves to ordinances and to the king in verse 13. Then in verse 18, chapter 2, he tells us to submit ourselves to our masters with all fear. I think that probably applies to us as we think about our bosses, thinking about those with authority over us. How do we treat them? How do we honor them? How do we subject ourselves to them? So he tells us to submit ourselves to these things, to ordinances, to people in position of authority in verse 13, to our bosses in verse 18, and then starting in chapter 3, likewise, to submit yourselves to those things, likewise, ye wives. Now, I didn't write this. I'm just reading it. If there's one thing that Satan has done a really good job of, it's turning the homes upside down. We've got to the point where we don't even classify anymore. How many genders we got now? I've lost track. It used to be 2. It's about 8 now, 8 or 10. I don't know how many genders we got now. But he starts talking about the function of the home here. Now, this isn't popular in 2020, 2021, is it? But he tells the wives here to be in subjection to your own husbands. And I think Peter is talking about a union here between a believer and a non-believer. Be careful if that's what you're wanting to get into. Probably not the right path, but he gives us an example here to the wives to be in subjections to their husbands. And then he says that if any obey not the word, they also may without the word be won by the conduct, the conversation or the behavior of the wives. Now, you wives that are married to non-believing husbands, how are you to treat them? How are you to respond to that? If you're a believer and your husband's a non-believer, what's the best way, Peter says, to win them? Give them a sermon every time they come home from work? Preach to them? It's not what he says here. He says that they may be won without the word, but by conduct or behavior of the wives. There's something in your heart right here that you should show that they should be able to see and respond to. This is an inward thing, not an outward thing. In verse 2, he says, while they look at or behold your innocent or pure conduct coupled with fear. You do not have to preach a sermon to them, but if you are living the way you should be living as a godly wife in subjection to your husband, then they should see that. They should behold that in verse 2. And in verse 3, who's adorning? What he says, let it not be an outward adorning. So it's not so much about physical things, braiding of the hair and wearing of gold or putting on nice clothing, but it's the hidden man of the heart. It's what's on the inside of you that they will see and respond to, Peter says. In that which is not corruptible. Now, our physical being is corruptible, isn't it? Even the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God, worth a great price. Turn back to Proverbs 31. We like to read this on Mother's Day. A virtuous woman in Proverbs 31. It talks about the price of this wife that Peter is describing here, the one that's meek, the one that's got a quiet spirit. And in Proverbs 31 verse 10, Solomon asked the question, who can find one of these? And what does he say about her value? Her price is far above rubies. If you're this wife or this lady that Peter is describing here, the world may not think much of you. And by the world's standards, you may not amount to much. If you're subjecting yourself to your husband and you're a meek and quiet spirit. But Solomon says your price is far above rubies in Proverbs 31:10. Peter says in verse 4, which is in the sight of God, a great price. You will be rewarded one day for your conduct as this godly woman that Peter is describing here. Verse 5, for after this manner in the old time, the holy women also who trusted in God adorned themselves, being in subjection unto their own husbands. Even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And then he says, whose daughters you are. You're Sarah's daughters. As long as you do well and are not afraid with any amazement. And then he starts talking to the husbands. We don't get out of this. Likewise, you husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor unto your wives, as unto the weaker vessel. Now, Peter says the wives are weaker vessels here. He's not talking about being intellectually weak, not talking about, being the dumb one and all these things that people try to make it out to be. He's simply saying that they are physically weaker than the husbands. But we are to honor our wives as unto the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. Now, turn back to Ephesians, and I can talk to the guys for just a second. I was hoping I was going to get out of this and just talk to the ladies when I was studying this. And then he hit me with verse 7. I was hoping Peter would just talk about the women and leave me alone. Ephesians 5. What about the husband? Now, let me ask you this, and Dr. McGee asked this in his commentary. If you're a believing wife and you're married to a non-believing husband, Peter says you are to subject yourselves to your husbands. What if the husband wants you to, go to the bar on Saturday night? What if he wants you to do those things? How do you react to that? How do you react to that? You're to subject yourselves, but he says, make your conduct. He also says, make sure your conduct there in verse 2 is innocent and pure. I don't think you should do it. That's my opinion. I would agree with that. And he brings up the point, if your husband asks you to rob a bank, are you going to drive the car for him, drive the getaway car? Where do you draw that line there? You're subjecting yourselves to your husbands. If you're married to a non-believing husband, then that may put you in some compromising positions, right? So there's a balancing act here. Ephesians 5, the husbands, verse 25. What's our role in the home? Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church. I wish Dale was here today. We'd have some fun with this. Loved the church and gave himself for it. So we're to love our wives in an equivalent way as Christ loved the church. Now, Christ loved the church, didn't he? He gave his life for the church. That's a pretty high bar. That he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word, that he might present it to himself a glorious church, Ephesians 5, verse 27, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that it should be holy and without blemish, verse 28. So ought men to love their wives as their own selves. Now we get selfish, don't we? How many of you love you more than anything that you can think of today? I love me. But the book of Ephesians tells me that I am to love my wife as I love myself. And he says, he that loveth his wife loves himself. Verse 28. For no man ever yet hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, even as the Lord loves and cherishes and nourishes the church. So you've got God as the head of this thing. You've got the husbands as the head of the house. And you've got wives being subjected to the husbands. That's how things ought to work. We've made a mess of that, haven't we? Back to 1 Peter 3. Verse 8. Finally, he switches from the home here and goes to the church. Be ye all of one mind, loving one another. Love one another. Does Christ tell us that people will know that we are his disciples if we have love for one another? Love for one another. Love as brothers. Show pity and be courteous. That sounds pretty logical, doesn't it? And then he tells us not to repay evil when people